Hi there, welcome to the video. My name's Josh, and today we'll be having a look at the weapon stats from the closed beta test of Darktide. So in classic Fat Shark fashion, it looks like a lot of the stats and information we have access to is actually quite vague. So I'm going to try and shed a little bit of light on what we're looking at here. Some of this will be speculative, but we should be able to come to some reasonable conclusions on most of the stats we've seen. And just so we're on the same page, we'll specifically be going over these stats that I've circled here, not the additional properties or traits shown on certain weapon rarities. Now to start off, I do want to touch on something that I've noticed about the weapon stats. So it looks like that weapon types, so for example lasguns as a whole, all share the exact same stats. So to give you a clearer example of this, if we look at both the MG4 and MG12 variants of the lasgun, they both share the exact same type of stats. But that said, keep in mind all of this is just based on what we had access to on the closed beta test. It's entirely possible that the weapon stats were just restricted during that test, and these could vary upon the actual release of the game. Alright, so first we're going to touch on the ranged weapons and their stats, then we'll move on to the melee weapons, and then we'll go over each of the stats individually and talk about what exactly they do, or at least speculate on some of the more obscure ones. So let's kick things off with the lasgun itself. We can see that it has a stat for damage, ammo, mobility, stopping power, and stability. For the autogun, we have stability, ammo, stopping power, mobility, and damage. Next, for the auto pistol, we have damage, mobility, collateral, ammo, and stopping power. For the combat shotgun, we have stability, ammo, stopping power, mobility, and damage. For the force staff, we have damage, blast radius, charge rate, warp resistance, and quell speed. For the Ogryn's kickback shotgun, we have damage, reload speed, range, stopping power, and mobility. Next, for the Ogryn's Ripper gun, we have damage, stability, ammo, collateral, and range. And lastly, for the Stub Revolver, we have damage, reload speed, penetration, critical bonus, and mobility. Now we'll jump into the melee weapons. First up, we've got the Catachan knives. They have stats for damage, cleave targets, mobility, and finesse. All melee weapons also have a plus stamina stat as well. Then we have the chainsword, which has a stat for damage, penetration, first target, mobility, and finesse. For the combat axe, we have damage, penetration, first target, mobility, and finesse. For the force sword, we have damage, finesse, warp resistance, mobility, and first target. For the Ogryn's cleaver, or big knife, we have damage, penetration, cleave damage, mobility, and first target. For the Ogryn's club, we have damage, penetration, defenses, mobility, and finesse. For the sapper shovel, we have damage, defenses, first target, mobility, and penetration. And lastly, for the Thunderhammer, we have damage, penetration, first target, defenses, and collateral. So you're probably asking yourself, what the hell does all of this mean? So let's go through each of the individual stats and explain what their function is. There were 20 stats in total from the closed beta test. Now I've put the stats into 3 different categories based on the information I could see from the closed test. So there seemed to be some stats that only applied to melee weapons, there were some that only appeared on ranged weapons, and then there were also general stats which applied across both ranged and melee weapons. So we'll start with the general stats. So first up we've got the damage stat. This one's fairly self-explanatory, it's essentially the base on modified damage of the weapon itself. Next up we have penetration. This one was actually clarified in a recent dev stream from a month ago. Basically, this is for punching through armoured targets. It's not actually for cleaving or shooting through additional enemies. Next, we have the mobility stat, which was also clarified a bit in that dev stream. Basically, it increases your sprint speed, your speed while aiming and shooting at enemies, and it also impacts the spread while you're moving and shooting from the hip. Next we have Collateral, which was also briefly clarified in that dev stream. This was explained to be a control stat that basically increases the suppression of your weapon and also the stagger. So I think the suppression element of this stat is more applying to the ranged weapons that it's attached to, in this case the auto pistol, so you can basically just spray into a group of enemies and force them behind cover, then charge and try and force them into melee combat. While the stagger element is probably more intended for the melee side of things, even though it might still apply to the ranged, because in this case the collateral stat was attached to the Thunderhammer, so having a high stagger would help you control hordes a bit easier. And the final general stat is actually specific to the Psyker, and that is warp resistance. While we don't have any direct confirmation, we can probably just apply a bit of common sense here, so this is likely just going to reduce the total amount of perils generated whenever you're using your staff or the Brain Burster ability. Now let's move on to the melee specific stats. First up we have a stat that applied to every single melee weapon we looked at, and that is plus stamina. So this should actually increase the number of stamina bars that you have on your stamina meter. You'll notice the stamina meter itself is a percentage, up to 100%, but there are actually additional bars underneath the percentage which would indicate a higher total amount of stamina. This is actually something I didn't even notice until I made this video and started looking into the plus stamina stat a bit deeper. So to give you a very direct example of this, while I was playing the Psyker, I had 3 bars underneath my stamina percentage while using the Force Sword. But while I was playing the Ogryn, I actually had 10 bars. So what this effectively means is that the Ogryn, in this case, would be able to sprint at maximum speed for longer, shove enemies more, and block additional damage before having to replenish their stamina. Next up we have the Finesse stat. So this one's a little bit of an unknown, but if it functions anything like Finesse from Vermintide 2, it'll basically be a modifier that will affect your critical hit and headshot damage. Next up we have the first target stat. This one we also don't have confirmation on, but I imagine it's going to function similar to the Smite talent that we have from Vermintide 2, where your attack will deal additional damage to the first target hit. So let's say your weapon cleaves through 3 enemies. This basically means that the first enemy that you've hit with your weapon will take additional damage from this first target stat, but will of course not apply to the other 2 enemies that you've cleaved with your attack. Next up we have the defenses stat. This one's probably the biggest enigma that we have here, since we just don't have any confirmation on how it actually functions or what it does, but let's do a little bit of speculation. So it's possible that it could just be a flat damage reduction. It could also be increasing the dodge count on your weapon. If you're not familiar with dodge count, it's basically the number of effective dodges that you can perform with a particular weapon. So just as a hypothetical, maybe the Catachan knives you can only dodge effectively 5 times, while with the Thunderhammer it might be 3 times. Those aren't the actual dodge count numbers for those weapons, by the way. I actually don't know what they are, but again, just as a hypothetical. The defense stat could also tie in with block cost reduction, effectively reducing the stamina consumed when you block an attack, and it could also tie in with stamina regeneration as well, which, as the name implies, increases the rate at which your stamina regenerates. So that's just some general speculation for the defenses stat. Let's move on to the cleave damage stat. So this should help reduce the damage drop-off when cleaving through multiple targets. To give you another hypothetical, let's say you're hitting 3 enemies. On the first enemy that you hit, you might deal 10 damage, the second target might take 7 damage, and the last target might take 4 damage. With a high cleave damage stat, it might be changed to the first target still taking 10 damage, maybe the second one takes 9 damage, and then the third one possibly takes something like 6 damage. So it's basically just making your attacks deal additional damage to the subsequent targets that you cleave through. And the last melee stat we have is the cleave target stat. So as the name implies, this one's basically going to increase the number of potential enemies that you can cleave through with a single swing. So if your cleave target stat is low, maybe your weapon's only cleaving through 2 or 3 enemies, but with a high cleave target stat, maybe you'll be cleaving through 5 or 6 enemies instead. Alright, let's now move on to the weapon stats that only appeared on the ranged weapons in the closed test. So, first we have reload speed. This one's fairly self-explanatory, it just increases the speed at which you can reload. Next we have critical bonus. This is another one that we don't have confirmation on, but I think there's 2 reasonable estimates that we can make. Either it's going to be an increased critical hit chance, or it's going to be an increased critical damage bonus, or possibly a combination of both. Next up we have the stability stat. This is another one that we got a bit of clarification on from the dev stream. This stat basically gives increased recoil control, control over your sway, and it also impacts suppression. Now, it wasn't actually clear from the dev stream if that was suppression that you're receiving from getting shot at, or the suppression that you apply to enemies that you're shooting at, but I'd say since this stat is about controlling your weapon, it's most likely going to help you control your weapon while getting suppressed by enemy fire. It was also noted that the recoil control is most impactful on the first few shots of your gun, and then it starts to taper off. So you're best off shooting in short bursts if you want to stay accurate. Next up we have the ammo stat. This will impact both the size of your magazine and also the amount of ammo that you have in reserve. So you'll probably notice that not all guns actually have this ammo stat. For example, the revolver has a set amount of 5 bullets in the chamber. Next up is stopping power, which was another stat that was clarified during the dev stream. This one basically increases the overall impact force of the weapon itself, basically allowing you to stagger enemies easier, and also providing additional armor penetration. So if you really like using a weapon like the combat shotgun, but you also really want to deal with the armored elite enemies like the maulers and crushers, then you might want to choose a combat shotgun that does have high stopping power. You might have also noticed that the only firearm that doesn't have the stopping power stat is the revolver, which instead has the penetration stat, which is only for armor penetration. Now, according to the dev stream, the reason for this is that the revolver actually has a very high built-in stagger value, and can stagger any enemy that is staggerable. Next up we have the range stat. We also don't have confirmation on this one, but again, I think we can apply a bit of common sense here. So this should help mitigate the damage drop-off when shooting from longer ranges. So just to give you a general example, a weapon might have a range of 10 meters, and as long as you're shooting within that 10 meter range, you'll deal maximum damage. And the further you move past that 10 meter range, the more your damage will start to drop off. So this stat should help increase your effective range. The last 3 stats we have are all specific to the force staff for the Psyker. The first one is blast radius, so this will increase the area of your charged right-click attack on the force staff. The next is the charge rate, so this should increase the speed at which that right-click charges. And the last one is quell speed, which will help you quell your perils of the warp faster. Alright, that covers all of the 20 stats that we saw during the closed beta test. Keep in mind, this isn't necessarily a conclusive list, since there very well could be additional stats from weapons that we haven't seen yet on the official release. But that said, I do hope that you've learnt a thing or two. I know I certainly have doing the research for this video. And sound off in the comments if you have any takes on some of the more obscure stats that I went over. Alright, that's it for today's video. Thanks for watching, guys, and take it easy.